supposed to be a book right here? Oh. It's one thing that I get myself trapped inside a Paper Mario cutscene, but now there's stuff missing. I really should stop listening to that guy in the dark alley.
Are you sure? No side effects at all, bud. Take one of those and you'll be built like Luigi in no time.
Well, since I'm here, I might as well talk about the game in case anyone happens to be listening.
Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door, a game seemingly doomed to stay exclusive to the GameCube forever. It hasn't been sold for any other console in any capacity, physically or digitally, since its original release. The price of this game in any reasonable condition is, well, a little on the expensive side.
I might be a little short. So that's all you got? And this. That ain't gonna do it either. In case you didn't know, we do accept organs as payment. Well, why didn't you just lead with that?
Now, I may have been overpaying a bit with my kidney, and that guy in the store may have been scamming me a bit with the price, but you know what they say, all's well that ends well. I got my copy of the game, and I'm only one organ short because of it. But why has this game been stuck for nearly 20 years on one of Nintendo's worst-selling consoles of all time? Yes, that number is one of the worst for them. Wouldn't they want to bring it to a bigger install base? Cough, cough. This original console imprisonment could be for a variety of reasons. There is a literal gallows right smack in the middle of the main hub of the game. There's also this. Despite all of that, they still convinced them to put the 5th letter of the alphabet on the cover.
I'm sorry, sir. I just can't swing this one. He is literally grabbing her... You got yourself an E for everyone.
My point is, the game is a little bit more risky with its theming and dialogue than any Nintendo game usually is. It's possible that nowadays the game could even pull a teen rating, especially with how flirtatious both Madame Flurry and Miss Mouse can get during certain parts of the game. But I digress. I'm not here today to spew tinfoil hat theories at you about something I have absolutely zero knowledge about or authority over. That's what I use the lady at the DMV for.
Sir, can you please leave? You are holding up the line.
You're not f***ing listening. The Home Depot is putting cheeseburgers in their plywood.
It is no secret that many people hold this game near and dear to their hearts, and after playing through it in its entirety for the first time ever myself, I definitely feel the same way now. So much so that I'm putting it in 3rd place on my oddly varied list of all-time favorite games. However, as you would expect, the game is not perfect. It gets pretty damn close, but there's still plenty to complain about. Welcome to episode 6 of Imagining the Best Sequel, a show where we aim to take a deep dive into the design of our favorite games and discuss what could be done to create the greatest sequel possible. This episode covers Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door, the so-called legendary magnum opus of Mario RPGs. I want to take a look at every single aspect of this game in excruciating detail, but because of how big and surprisingly deep the game is, I can't do that. Instead, I'm going to talk about most aspects of the game in a little bit less than excruciating detail. Like I said, this game is very well made, possibly one of the best even, so don't be surprised if I get extremely nitpicky in what I suggest to be improved upon in a potential sequel. Regardless, I do still think there are some bigger, more glaring issues with the game despite its quality that I will try to get out of the way before moving on to the nitpicking in each category.
Exhibit A. Mario removes his shirt exactly 0 times throughout this entire game. Now, if we take a look at this same statistic in Super Mario Odyssey, oh my god! That's more than 0, isn't it?
Before we start, I want to address something that always comes up in conversation when discussing Paper Mario nowadays, and that is just how much the series has changed since its original entry. To keep it very brief, basically since the third game's release on the Wii in 2007, the series has slowly shifted away from its original RPG-inspired formula in favor of a more adventure game-styled approach, for lack of a better word. All you really need to know is that many fans didn't like this change, along with another that sucked a lot of the personality and uniqueness out of the series following the release of Sticker Star. However, that conversation isn't relevant here, as we're still in the sweet, sweet year of 2004, where none of that has even happened yet. So forget about it for now, and we can go live in this delusion for a little bit. This episode is part of a sub-series of 3 covering the latest entries in the 3 quote-unquote eras of Paper Mario. The first era includes the N64 original and Thousand Year Door, while the second era exclusively includes Super Paper Mario, and finally the most recent era includes Sticker Star, Color Splash, and Origami King. In case you were too stupid to put 2 and 2 together, this episode covers Thousand Year Door, the next will cover Super Paper Mario, and the final will cover Origami King. Fans, both new and old, are pretty divided on how bad the most recent 3 games actually were. I personally don't think they're terrible by any means, except this one, but they definitely aren't great. Regardless, that's a discussion better fitted for the Origami King episode. Let's finally dive into this absolute behemoth of a Mario game and see what we can add and improve. Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door has a story that seems completely out of place for a game featuring the tomato-colored hero. The GameCube era is famous for experimenting heavily with every franchise it released games for, and despite its small user base during its initial run, has produced plenty of cult classics that are still heavily appreciated to this day. The Thousand Year Door is no exception. Remember that price tag? For those who aren't familiar, don't remember, or just need a refresher on this game's story, allow me to give a very brief synopsis of just about everything you need to know about the overarching plot of this title. Obviously, this means you will get spoiled if you plan on playing the game and, well, care about being spoiled. If that's the case, then why are you even here?
Well, I had a bit of free time before my colonoscopy, heard some guy talking in the other room, and thought, what the hell? You gonna keep talking? I got 15 minutes before a camera shoved up my
The
ass.
story of Thousand Year Door begins when Peach decides to take a cruise, eventually stopping in the crime-ridden town of Rogueport to refuel the boat. During this intermission, she meets a hooded woman who sells her a box that is said to only open for someone who is pure of heart. When Peach purchases the box, it obviously opens and she discovers the magical map inside. Excited about her discovery, she sends the map along with a letter to Mario telling him to meet her in Rogueport as soon as possible. However, by the time Mario arrives, Peach has been kidnapped by Sir Grotus, the leader of the X-Nauts, and taken far away. And by far away, I mean a secret base on the moon, which isn't actually found out until far later into the game. Upon arriving in Rogueport, Mario does battle with another higher-up in the X-Naut crew known as Lord Crump, and eventually ends up teaming up with Goombella, who is also interested in helping find the treasures of Mario's new map. They consult Professor Frankly about the map, who tells them that it's related to the legendary treasure behind the Thousand Year Door, which is located below Rogueport. In order to open this door, Mario must collect all 7 crystal stars that are scattered across the land. Luckily, the map can reveal the locations of each one. How convenient. So Mario sets out to find all the crystal stars, fighting lots of bad guys, meeting lots of good guys, and building a party of companions along the way. This part of the journey isn't really relevant to understanding the big picture, apart from the time where some lady in Twilight Town talks about how she wants to trade in her husband for a new one, I think that delivers a good message. However, later down the line, when Mario finally sets his sights on the last crystal star located on the aforementioned moon, we discover that Peach has been taken away once again before Mario could even get there. Tech, a supercomputer located within the X-Naut Fortress and that also apparently has the hots for Peach, informs Mario that she has been taken to the Palace of Shadow, finally revealing what was located behind the 1,000-year door. Once Mario makes his way through the Palace of Shadow, he finally confronts Sir Grotus for the first time, who informs them of their ignorance in falling into his trap. Grotus, the supposed mastermind behind all of it, teamed up with the Shadow Sirens to execute this plan, one of which was actually the disguised merchant from the beginning of the game known as Beldam, which the player encounters multiple times throughout the adventure. The other members of the Shadow Sirens include Vivian and Marilyn, the former of which leaves the group and teams up with Mario during Chapter 4. Supposedly, the plan was as follows. Peach's pure heart allows for the magical map to finally leave the box and reveal the locations of the crystal stars. The X-Nauts then capture Peach, bring her to their base, and use her as bait for Mario to collect all of the crystal stars for them. Once that was done, all parties would converge in the Palace of Shadow. Grotus would take out Mario, retrieve the crystal stars that were so conveniently gathered for him, and the final step of the plan commences. As you would expect though, Mario defeats Grotus, but then, immediately after that, Bowser randomly crashes through the ceiling, landing on top of the villain, leading into a battle with the King Koopa himself, because apparently we've always gotta fight Bowser at some point.
Yup, says so right here.
Mario absolutely destroys Bowser, but after the fight, Grotus seems to have disappeared. They push further into the palace and meet him in a later room containing a stone coffin with Peach lying in front of it. It is revealed that Peach's true purpose was to use her pure-hearted body as a vessel for an ancient demon known as the Shadow Queen. The Shadow Queen possesses Peach, then eventually expands to show her true form. Mario defeats her, and all is well in Rogueport and the surrounding areas. Why can't we have an ending where everyone just dies for a change? Obviously, I left out quite a few details, but what we have here is a pretty solid RPG-esque story. Stakes are high, villains are established and present throughout the narrative, characters are tied together in various ways across various locations, the whole 9 yards. Now, it's nothing close to as complicated as something like the Xenoblade Chronicles series, but it doesn't have to be, and sometimes that series can be a bit too complicated anyway. As much as I've complained about the lack of story in many Mario games before, the main focus of them has always been the gameplay. To me, 1,000 Year Door strikes the perfect balance between the two. After all, a complete scarcity of any substantial story just wouldn't work at all in the format of any Paper Mario game, or any Mario RPG for that matter. And while the story of 1,000 Year Door is definitely an extremely important part of the game, I don't really have much to say about it in the realm of improvements. I really enjoyed it, and the game was very well written. After all, Paper Mario is known for its witty and engaging writing. Granted, I wouldn't exactly consider myself a qualified individual when it comes to assessing the quality of narratives, but I can definitely tell when a story is far too bare bones for its own good. And if you couldn't tell already, this is definitely not one of those cases. I am, however, trying to cover all of my bases here, and while the story does have a few problems that I'll mention soon enough, they're not related to the writing or theming in any way, and tie into a bigger issue with the game as a whole. The world of 1,000 Year Door is arguably one of, if not the most fleshed out locale in the entire Mario franchise. The game is filled to the brim with lore, backstory, history, and any other synonyms for the exact same word that I can't think of right now. Heck, there's even an entire character dedicated to spouting mounds of dialogue at you about the history of Rogueport, the 1,000 Year Door, and all surrounding areas. Every piece of information delivered by this character, who is tucked away and hidden on the roof of one of the houses on the far side of town, is completely unnecessary in understanding the main story or completing the game in general, and frankly, I love it. There are plenty of other ways the game contributes to world building that I'll mention in a bit, but I want to touch on another aspect that goes hand in hand with this, and that is immersion. The world created by the developers and how convincing that world is a huge factor in immersing the player into the game, and while the story and world building are big factors when it comes to immersion, another thing to look out for is the breaking of the fourth wall. Now, I don't think the fourth wall shouldn't ever be broken. It can provide for some great comic relief and is also sometimes necessary to convey things to the player. However, I feel like this game has plenty of opportunities to stay within the game's universe, but chooses not to do so. I told you this was going to be extremely nitpicky, and here's where it starts. This immersion breaking mainly materializes within the game's tutorials, most notably whenever a new partner joins Mario's party. Whenever this happens, the game will swap to some other dimension and teach you the partner's abilities, being explained by an unnamed entity inside a text box. My question is, why couldn't the partners themselves explain their own abilities? They're the ones performing them, not Mr. Box in the Sky. It would have made so much more sense to have the partner tell you what they can do, demonstrate it, and then move on with the game without entering this unnecessary purgatory. A similar thing happens whenever you find an upgrade for your boots or hammer. You enter this same dimension, but this time Toadette shows up to explain the new ability that you gain from the gear upgrade. Toadette does not appear anywhere else in this game, so as far as we know, she's just trapped in this dimension, waiting for Mario to show up. If I were to try and fix this, I wouldn't involve her at all, since it would seem pretty shoehorned in if she just happened to show up whenever you found upgrades. Instead, maybe inside the chest where this gear is found, a paper with directions and pictures on how to use the new abilities could be included that Mario finds and reads to learn his new powers. The paper could even be written by some ancient hero with a quirky writing style that recurs throughout the course of the game every time you find a new upgrade. This may seem extremely minor in the grand scheme of things, and that's because it is, but at least to me, it does a lot in making the game feel that much more polished. Tutorials in a general sense are something rarely done perfectly in a game. In my opinion, the best tutorials require as little text as possible. The game will show the player how the mechanic works within the context of the game itself, and not do this.
Figure it out, dipshit.
As another example, when the player is introduced to the email system early in the game, the voice from Purgatory shows up once again to explain the system to the player. What could have been done here is that the player could have just received an email on this email device that explains the email system to them. Something along the lines of, "Thank you for your purchase of this Mailbox SP. This introductory email is dedicated to giving you all the information you need in order to use your new device," and then they would go on to explain how to use the device. Another thing I found odd throughout the story relating to the world itself was how Mario gained new moves from the crystal stars. Whenever Mario completes a chapter, he'll gain one of these stars, and every time this happens, yet again, Mr. Who Knows What shows up to inform you that you learned a new move. In this case, though, it's even worse than the others. You are not told what the move does, you are not told how to use the move, and you are not given any context as to how Mario managed to learn the move. At least in the first game, you knew that the powers were granted to Mario by each corresponding star spirit that he saved, but in this case, all we get is a message from the all-knowing narrator that Mario learned insert move here.
Hey, thanks again for helping me find my dog.
Of course, I'm happy to help. By the way, you now know how to perform open heart surgery. Oh, okay.
Now that the story, immersion, and world building are all out of the way, we can finally acknowledge that this title is actually much more than that. The game puts a heavy focus on gameplay, and the fact that I just spoke about anything but that for over 15 minutes really shows that I have serious difficulties when it comes to being concise and to the point.
And then after about 9 months of being in there, I started to make my way out of the womb.
I thought this was about your trip to the store today.
I'm getting there!
When it comes to in-game systems, Thousand Year Door, for the most part, simply builds upon and improves everything that was present in the first game. Now, when I say systems, I'm referring to things like the game's economy and how it relates to item shops and buying things in general, cooking, troubles, badges, partners, and any collectibles that tie into these, such as star pieces or shine sprites. The battle system, however, is its own beast that I will get to in due time. The first system I want to take a look at involves the game's economy. In regards to how evenly coins are distributed and how easy it is to make money, I found that overall it seems pretty balanced. You never have too much money, and I never thought I was particularly scrapped for cash at any point. Your biggest money sink in this game is going to be in purchasing badges, which have prices that reach the several hundreds. But purchasing them is in no way necessary to reach the credits. There are a few other ways to spend your coins, such as when healing yourself at these boxes, but the most prominent purpose for your money is going to be in shops. Shops provide useful items for Mario that are generally used within the context of battles. I'll elaborate more on the items themselves later, but for now I just want to focus on a certain aspect of shops known as the Shop Points program. Every time you purchase an item from any shop, you will receive 1 shop point. After accumulating enough of them, you will be given rewards at certain shop point thresholds ranging from 10 all the way up to 300 shop points for the final reward. Here's the thing though, nobody is going to buy 300 items in a normal playthrough. Hell, no one is probably even using 300 items in total throughout their playthrough, and that includes all the times they obtain them outside of shops. Now, if you know what you're doing and have an afternoon burning a hole in your pocket, there are a few ways to exploit the system to get to this 300 mark pretty fast. But at that point, what's the purpose of the shop point system at all anymore? It's supposed to encourage you to buy various items by rewarding you for doing so, not have you just sit there and waste your time just to get a few mildly useful things that honestly aren't even worth it. Not that any of it matters though, the shop points operate on a prestige system, so if you do manage to get to 300 for some reason, you'll receive the final reward and then fall all the way back to 0 again. Isn't that just great?
Sure. If by great you mean f***ing stupid.
The worst thing about this for me is the fact that every item is only worth 1 single shop point, regardless of its price. A dead piece of fungi is worth the same amount of points as 3 solid gold bars, so this system can either be a complete scam or the best deal of your life, depending on how you use it. Either way, it would have obviously worked way better if shop points were rewarded based on the price of the item, with cheaper items rewarding less points and more expensive items rewarding more. On top of that, if you wanted to make the shop point system, or rather shops in general, even less tedious, the ability to purchase multiple items at once would go a long way. If I want 5 mushrooms, I don't want to have to sit there and spam the A button until I go through the prompts 5 separate times. Just let me select 5 from the start. It's the same case with selling items as well. Your inventory is another thing that goes hand in hand with shopping and the economy. You can only hold so many items, 10 to be precise, which is not a lot. I was struggling to manage my inventory for the majority of the game, always weighing the pros and cons of dropping one item to replace another, and I rarely bought from shops. Now, I understand why the limit is set so low. Battles would become extremely trivialized if you were able to just hold tons of items at all times. However, even having the 10 can completely exploit most battles, especially if you have the double dip badge equipped once or maybe even twice, which allows you to use more than one item in a single turn. So to me, that seems like a non-argument. Regardless, it's not all bad. You can actually double your inventory space by finding the strange sack after reaching floor 50 in the Pit of 100 Trials, the game's longest and hardest combat challenge by a long shot. The ability to fight your way through waves of enemies in order to double your inventory space once you're strong enough to do so is a great bonus and all, but at least for me, I would have preferred that inventory upgrades happened incrementally as opposed to just jumping up suddenly like that. For example, in a potential sequel, let's say a new category of collectible is added known as expansion manuals. These ancient magical books can teach you the secrets to storing items more efficiently, freeing up more space in your bag.
It's not working for me.
These expansion manuals would give you 1 extra space in your bag every time you found one. The total amount of these manuals scattered across the world would really depend on the item balancing within this theoretical sequel, but the concept is there regardless. It encourages exploration and ties hidden collectibles into yet another aspect of the game to provide that constant feeling of incremental progression popularized by the RPG genre, which is always good in my eyes. The next system I want to take a look at is cooking. All of the cooking and cooking-related activities in Thousand Year Door are done in this single little building in Rogueport that contains a small kitchen and Zess tea, the spiritual successor to Taste Tea from the first game. Once Mario completes a preliminary quest to replace Zess Tea's contact lens that he stepped on, she will allow him to use the kitchen whenever he wants. The way cooking works in this game is extremely simple. You give Zess Tea an ingredient, she cooks it, then she gives you the completed dish. Different ingredients create different items with different effects, while some ingredients don't make anything other than a dish called a mistake.
Look, man, I just want to know where the hell this fish came from.
I don't know, I'm sorry.
I gave you a can of baked beans.
Please stop yelling.
Eventually, Mario will find a book that allows him to cook with 2 ingredients instead of only 1. Little did I know that once this happened, I was in for a world of tedium. There are a grand total of 57 possible dishes that Zess Tea can make with the various combinations of ingredients. And you want to know how many I managed to find throughout a full playthrough? 11. This involved completing absolutely everything the game had to offer aside from the recipe book itself. Hopefully that's enough of an indicator as to how detached this system is from any other aspect of the game's progression. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Fun side activities that have no bearing on the player's ability to reach the credits are always great. However, with cooking, the system has virtually no bearing on the game in general, let alone the main story or side progression. There are a grand total of 2 side quests that require you to cook something in Zess Tea's kitchen, netting you the amazing rewards of 20 coins and some dried up flowers.
I missed my kid's funeral for this.
While the dishes made in this building can be quite useful in battle, both offensively and defensively, the time required to make them is never worth it. You're better off just using whatever you happen to find while out exploring and maybe purchasing some items if you need them. The problem is that the game is extremely easy to begin with. Most players aren't going to need these potent cooking items because, for one, you find items all over the place outside of battle, and 2, there are 2 star power moves that can literally heal you and restore your flower points better than most items can anyway. Even if you were theoretically so bad at the game that you needed the assistance of Zess Tea's cooking skills, would you even be knowledgeable enough to take advantage of the system to begin with? So let's say you want to cook every recipe anyway, just for the quote-unquote fun of it. How is the experience going to look? Well, unless you're using a guide, most of the process is definitely not going to be what some may call fun. Many ingredients are very difficult to find, and most of the recipes either don't have any hints as to how to make them, or are located within some random dialogue or an email that you're likely to brush over accidentally. For all the others, you're simply left to experiment yourself to find them, which can be a massive waste of time and ingredients. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with looking up a guide on how to do something in a game, but at least in my opinion, it is at the fault of the game when you are essentially forced to look up said guide. And since this game released in 2004, your options for guides would be extremely limited compared to what we have now with the evolution of the internet. Because of this annoying process, just to make it a little easier on myself, here you can see me using an action replay code for infinite money just to make sure I'm not ever shortchanged on some ingredients and forced to grind coins until I can buy whatever I'm going for. In this case, a small issue with the game's economy becomes apparent. If you happen to use the items needed for cooking when you find them out in the wild, you'll be forced to pay a hefty premium to get them after the fact instead, since the majority of them won't respawn after you collect them the first time. Ultra Shrooms are a great example of this, coming in at 200 coins each, 120 if you're lucky enough that one shows up in Charlieton's shop. However, in my opinion, it makes much more sense to blame the structure of the cooking system itself rather than the economy here. So here's my solution to all of this. Make every recipe discoverable in some way within the game itself, whether that be by finding them on loose papers in hidden areas, being informed of them during dialogue with NPCs, or by receiving emails that contain them. These recipes would then be logged into your recipe book, so you won't have to write them down or remember them yourself. In this case, recipes in the book would have 3 different states: undiscovered, discovered but not cooked, and cooked. With this approach, it removes a lot of the guesswork involved with finding all the recipes without a guide, and makes it much easier for the player to keep track of which ones they've found but still need to cook. In addition, it could also be beneficial to add more cooking spots than just the main town in a potential sequel. Let's say Zesty has some relatives or colleagues spread across the world that are just as good at cooking as she is. Mario could discover these new cooking spots and maybe even learn some new recipes or skills by visiting them. An information seller in the Rogueport sewers named Wonky actually says that Zesty has a sister, with many speculating that this sister is Tasty, since he mentions her moving far away. As a side note, Wonky is actually where you can learn most of the handful of recipes that are actually discoverable in-game. Even with all of that, my main problem with the cooking system still stems from how seemingly detached it feels from the rest of the game. Putting the tedium of actually completing the entire recipe book aside, I would have loved to have seen cooking take on a more integral role to the game in general, even if it wasn't related to the main story. Aside from those 2 side quests I already mentioned, the only other times where speaking to Zesty is necessary for any progression is when you break her contact lens, which prevents you from accessing West Rogueport, and also when you accept her side quest to find the secret book that allows you to cook with 2 ingredients. Hiding recipes all over the world only solves half the problem though. It doesn't actually incentivize the player to go cook them. Perhaps Zesty could reward the player with useful items or upgrades for introducing new recipes to her and allowing her to hone her craft. Maybe some of these rewards could be the expansion manuals I mentioned earlier, at least something to make the effort worthwhile. At its core, there really is a good system here with a lot of potential. If you ignore the needless ambiguity, excessive backtracking, and loads of spent coins associated with filling out the entire recipe book, the process is somewhat enjoyable. But then again, that's like asking someone to ignore a rusty hammer in their soup when you serve it to them.
You can probably just pick that out.
Other than that though, I just have one more thing to say about cooking. For the love of God, please let me skip the cutscene that plays every single time you cook something. It is so long, the music gets annoying very quickly, and it really just feels like a gigantic waste of time. Even worse is the fact that this sequence is significantly shorter in the first game. You know, we don't have many years on this Earth. I don't want to collectively spend one of them watching the cooking cutscene in Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door.
It's just so sad to see him go, you know? He died doing what he hated.
Now, before I can even think about going any further, I need to finally talk about the battle system. Everything I want to mention after this requires that I build off of something relating to battles, which is a good sign overall. So, to start, out in the field, if any enemy happens to see Mario, they'll start pursuing him. If they do happen to touch him, then a battle starts. At this time, depending on if they're in an attack animation when they touch Mario, they can also deal damage before the player is even given their first turn. Conversely, Mario can attack them and deal his own damage from the get-go, either with a hammer or jump. This is known as a first strike. Once in the battle, Mario can jump on the enemy, whack them with a hammer, use an item, or use a star power move. Badges, of which I mentioned earlier, can give Mario new moves and abilities in battle, each of which costs flower points to execute. Some badges can also grant passive effects that don't require spending FP at all. Additionally, Mario also has a second party member in the form of his partner that assists both in and out of battle, but I'll get to those soon enough. A new battle mechanic that is introduced in Thousand-Year Door is the audience. The audience is a group of people, mostly non-people, who just sit and watch Mario do his battling, which has various lore implications that I won't get into right now, but also closely connects to the battle system itself. When Mario does cool stuff on stage during battles, the audience will cheer for him and give him star power, which allows him to perform more powerful special moves. The better Mario performs in battle and the more cool stuff he does, the larger the audience will get, and in turn, the more star power he will receive. This cool stuff mainly includes performing attacks. However, there are other actions that can be performed in tandem with attacking, of which I have yet to mention, that reward even more star power on top of the base amount. Additionally, almost every different audience member has a chance to perform their unique action that can affect the battle in various ways, many of which are so rare or subtle that you'll likely never even notice them. Though the main thing that every single Mario RPG is known for when it comes to battles is action commands. Action commands are Nintendo's way of Nintendo-fying a traditional turn-based RPG battle system. Ever since the very beginning with Super Mario RPG, whenever the player would attack an enemy, they would also have the opportunity to press buttons with certain timing to increase the effect of the attack. They could also decrease the damage dealt from enemies using the same concept. It's really a mystery as to why so many other turn-based RPGs refrain from adopting this approach, since one of the main reasons so many people are turned away from turn-based battle systems is how unengaging they can really be. Even if you ignore the inherent monotony that comes with using a system like that, sometimes during battles, all you can really do is wait.
Yeah, can I get a number 2?
This mechanic has been refined quite a bit ever since then, with the original Paper Mario introducing a far greater variety of action commands compared to Super Mario RPG. In the case of both that game and especially Thousand Year Door, action commands continue to be iterated upon and polished, with things like moving the analog stick in certain ways, mashing buttons repeatedly, pressing buttons in a specific order, or timing your button presses to prompts on screen. Basically, the N64 original popularized this upgrade to the mechanic, and Thousand Year Door merely polished it up. Overall, I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with action commands in Thousand Year Door. What I do think though is that they can be fleshed out even further. My suggestion is to add these commands to every single possible action you can perform in battle. You know, because that's what the name implies. I'd love to see action commands applied to item usage, allowing you to deal more damage or increase the effect the item gives. We can also add them to the defend and appeal actions, allowing you to buff your defense even more or get more star power from the audience, respectively. However, these commands could also be given an even bigger facelift by implementing Thousand Year Door's new feature that takes action commands to a whole new level. Stylish moves are a new feature added in Thousand Year Door that are never really explained to the player unless you happen to talk with this random guy in the Rogueport sewers who only ends up telling you how to perform a small percentage of them anyway. They're sort of like an extension to action commands in that you perform them in tandem by pressing A within a different specified window. I know, crazy, right? Executing stylish commands produces more star power from the audience, and many moves actually have multiple opportunities to get the stylish indicator. Every single move in the game, including those from partners, has at least one stylish command. For me, this added an extra layer of complexity to battles that made them far less tedious than they were in the first game. This was both because of how tricky the timing could be to pull these commands off and figuring out where you actually had to press the button to execute them. An inherent weakness of turn-based battles is the monotony of trudging through fights against easy enemies that you've already encountered countless times before simply because you happen to run into them. This is even worse if the game has random encounters, but luckily that's not the case here. Either way, at some point or another in any playthrough, mundane battles like these usually amounted to just... The first Paper Mario game was no exception to this pitfall, but the addition of stylish commands in Thousand Year Door definitely helped to remedy that tedium. However, much like action commands, stylish commands are not present on items, defending, or appealing, and in the case of these specifically, not on special moves either. I think it would make fights even more engaging if all of these actions also had stylish commands attached to them. On top of this, because of how little this mechanic is actually mentioned to the player, many people probably play through the entire game without even knowing they exist. They aren't exactly easy to accidentally perform. I would love to see these given a bit more discoverability throughout a potential sequel. Not through a tutorial, because no one likes the pace killing those bring, but perhaps through more than just one single NPC with little to no significance to the average person. If you don't go out of your way to talk to everyone, you probably won't figure out what stylish moves even are. Or, and I'm just throwing this out here, what if more than one single NPC can give advice on executing stylish moves? Additionally, maybe vague and cryptic instructions on how to perform certain stylish moves could be found in hidden areas around the world. Let's say the player stumbles upon a secret hole in the ground. They jump in and fall down into a cave. There's a chest down here with some reward and also a carving on the wall that reads, "Care to whack enemies with flair? Tap A when your mallet connects to launch backwards into the air."
What?
Despite all of this, learning stylish moves becomes much easier as soon as you happen to run into a little badge known as the Timing Tutor. Applying this badge makes a small exclamation point appear above the player's head whenever they have the opportunity to perform a stylish move. You might have noticed this already during earlier segments. This badge completely removes the mystery of figuring out these moves, but also makes performing them considerably easier. It's sort of a trade-off, because some of the timing windows for certain moves are a little too strict or vague for my taste, so it's nice to have assistance when I want it. Regardless, this badge isn't what I would call cheap, and it does use up one of your badge points, which can be very precious towards the beginning of the game. It's definitely up for interpretation whether these checks and balances create a balanced product for any given player. Now, I would have personally preferred that you found or even earned this badge through a quest instead of having to buy it from a rotating shop with randomized items, but that is merely a drop in the bucket of complaints. One thing to note is that once your star power is full from doing these in tandem with every single attack, and you don't necessarily need to perform a flashy and long-winded special move at that time, the necessity of performing stylish moves at all essentially drops to zero until you consume star power again. So yes, I would love to see more incentive to perform these extra commands in a potential sequel, but for now I'm fine with the dopamine hit provided by the nice little sound effect and dancing pink letters. Who cares if it's not benefiting me in the slightest within the game itself? Enough about Mario though, let's talk about everyone he murders. My main complaint about enemies stems from the fact that they constantly want to pick a fight with you, no matter how powerful you are compared to them. Yet another disease of the RPG genre is still having to battle the enemies from early parts of the game, no matter your level or stats. It's very likely that you'll just one-shot any encounter with these, and it's not like you'll be getting any substantial rewards either, so it just ends up being a waste of time. It's the same in Thousand Year Door. No matter your level, every enemy will always charge towards you the second they notice you. At that point, we really do return back to... As per usual, there is a badge that circumvents this problem known as Bump Attack, instantly killing enemies that no longer grant any experience without entering into a battle sequence at all, but there are quite a few trade-offs here as well. To start, this badge is not obtainable until floor 80 of the Pit of 100 Trials, even further than floor 50 for the Strange Sack. This floor would not feasibly be reachable for a player of average skill until you were well on your way to the end of the game, so the luxury isn't even available to you until then. On top of this, the badge itself costs 5 points to equip. That is an extremely large amount to give up, considering the fact that it doesn't benefit you at all when you're actually in battle, as most other badges do. Alternatively, there is another similar badge called First Attack that only costs 1 point to equip, with the caveat being that you have to successfully perform a first strike on the weak enemy in order to skip the battle. This is also accessible much earlier in the game, within the lovely House of Badges after clearing Chapter 2. But even with all of that, this still creates more inconvenience for the player than it should. The solution to this problem is probably pretty obvious. Make the effect of the Bump Attack badge present at all times. Remove the badge entirely. It really does seem like it should just be an inherent mechanic of the game, not one that is applied by wasting one of the player's most precious resources. However, since some players may still want to rebattle these enemies regardless for whatever reason, the mechanic could either have enemies simply stop chasing the player after a certain threshold, allowing them to trigger a fight at will, or even better, allow the player to speak to these enemies who no longer want to pick a fight and trigger a short, unique dialogue sequence for that specific enemy that gives the player the choice to fight them anyway. If we return back to the battles themselves, there's one more issue that was pretty prevalent when it came to enemies that I noticed. Whenever they attack, sometimes it is very difficult to tell whether they're going to hit Mario or his partner. This is annoying because the timing for action commands are are slightly different depending on who the enemy attacks, since they have to travel different distances for each target. There should be at least some sort of indicator before the attack begins as to which character is taking the hit. Now, I'm not saying they should put a big red arrow over the head of the target, that would be too obvious. Instead, I would love to see them take an approach similar to the Mario and Luigi series, where the enemies have a subtle animation that indicates which party member they plan to attack. On top of improving what's currently present in the battle system, there are a couple things that I would like to add to it as well. I'm gonna keep it pretty broad here, as I've never thought that extremely specific additions were very productive to discuss at all. The main addition I have in mind is the implementation of terrain into battles. Both of the first two Paper Mario games had their battles play out on completely flat ground, aside from a few small exceptions. In Thousand Year Door, this flatness makes even more sense considering you're standing on a stage. However, just to give the battle system that bit of extra innovation it needs in a potential sequel, I would love to see multiple elevations for the ground introduced. We already have enemies that can be located at different elevations, and sometimes even on the ceiling, so this seems like a natural next step. Here's how I imagine it. Depending on the battle, sometimes Mario, the enemies, or both will be placed on terrain of 3 possible elevations, with one of them being the ground, obviously. Some battles can also only have 2 elevations, especially towards the beginning of the game to prevent the player from getting overwhelmed. During the battle, the elevation you're at can determine quite a few things. For example, if you're at a higher elevation than your enemy, you will deal slightly more damage to them using a jumping or ranged attack. When you're at a lower elevation, you won't be able to attack enemies with a normal hammer attack. However, at some point, the player could perhaps learn an ability to circumvent this where they do something like jumping up and swinging the hammer in midair. This would work conversely as well, dealing slightly less damage when attacking from a lower or higher elevation respectively. Being at equal elevation would just mean dealing a normal amount of damage. Additionally, if an enemy is sitting under an elevated platform, Mario won't be able to jump on them at risk of hitting his head on the platform above, making a hammer attack necessary to deal any damage. However, these damage increases can't be too significant since I don't want the player to be screwed over just because they were unlucky in the elevation they got at the start of the battle. I still want it to feel fair no matter the circumstance. After all, I don't want the battle system to end up feeling like one big gimmick with only a single intended path to the solution that the player is essentially forced to take. In addition, at any point, Mario can use up one of his turns to swap elevations. There could also be a badge that allows you to swap without wasting a turn, though it should probably be pretty expensive to equip since that is quite a powerful ability to have. Building upon this even further, enemies could be designed and utilized around the various levels of elevation as well. For example, when a Koopa attacks, they'll be able to drop down any number of elevation numbers while inside their shell to hit the player, but they won't be able to return to their initial elevation afterwards since they aren't able to jump very high. This also means that they won't be able to attack you at all if they don't have wings and you happen to be at a higher elevation. Or if you happen to be at a lower elevation than a spiny or buzzy beetle, you can hit its underside to flip it over from below. Another enemy idea I had involved pokies. Let's say you have a 4-segment pokey on the battlefield. This pokey is so tall that it actually stretches across 2 elevations. However, if Mario uses his hammer to whack 2 segments off the bottom of it, the 2 segments at the top will drop onto the higher elevation, so now another hammer attack becomes impossible unless Mario switches elevations himself. Items could also play special roles at certain elevations as well, but to explain this a bit better, I have to reveal the final feature of my terrain and elevation-based system. Every distinct area in the game will present different mediums of terrain while still keeping the core elevation mechanic intact. So far, I've only been describing elevations in the fashion of semi-solid platforms anchored to the ground, meaning that in order to traverse them, you would jump up through them to switch elevations. The new system would also feature terrain arranged as hills, removing the semi-solid aspect and having you walk up and down the slopes, clouds removing the fact that they are anchored to the ground, or even lava-coated or electrified pieces of terrain that only certain enemies can stand on, or that with special boots, Mario can stand on. Back to items though, the main idea I had involved any item that deals earthquake damage to enemies. If you use one of these items with any terrain type that's anchored to the ground, enemies will take damage. However, if it isn't anchored, such as the clouds, then they obviously wouldn't. Another example could involve the fire flower. This item would only affect enemies at the current elevation or higher, meaning that anything below it won't be damaged at all. Anyways, as you can probably tell by now, there is a ton of versatility when it comes to implementing this new elevation system. Obviously, there's the possibility that some of these ideas wouldn't work well in practice, or that combining this many ideas would start to shy away from the spirit of simplicity associated with Paper Mario as a whole, but all I really wanted to do here was brainstorm in order to give a small taste of all that could possibly be done.
And I've already filed a patent, so don't even freaking think about it.
Also, just a side note about battles that wouldn't really fit anywhere else. A potential sequel needs to have more battle music. Thousand Year Door has unique themes for bosses and event battles and tutorial battles, but other than that, you're always stuck with one single track. I'd love to hear different battle themes that correspond to different areas of the game. Perhaps a leitmotif could be used to kind of unite them all. Or not. Doesn't really matter to me. I just want more music. The partner system is another one with huge potential for expansion. As it stands, this system serves its purpose quite well, with every partner's abilities being utilized evenly outside of battle, for the most part. I don't think it's feasible to try and make their utility completely equal anyway. However, when we take a look at partners inside of battle, the discrepancy becomes much more apparent. When battling, some partners are just so much more useful than others. Now, it's no question that every partner has unique moves that do some pretty cool things, especially once you upgrade them, but none of this really matters for the most part, once again because of the game's easy difficulty. Partner moves can do anything from inflicting status effects to siphoning health, buffing the player, preventing damage, or even giving Mario extra turns. But in the vast majority of battles, your best course of action is just a brute force approach. Go complete caveman mode and just pummel the enemy until they're dead. Not only does this make battles less interesting, it completely undermines the utility of all these extra abilities that the partners possess. Even further, this also incentivizes the player to exclusively use partners focused on high damage output, which means that Vivian, Miss Mouse, and maybe even Madame Flurry are utilized far less often than the others. Granted, I tried to diversify my partner use as much as possible in this playthrough, just for the sake of variety and experiencing everything so that I could deliver a more accurate analysis, but I can guarantee you that the average player is not going to do that. They will simply stick with the partner they like the most as often as they can, whatever that reason may be.
I wish you were real.
There are very few situations when it comes to battles where certain partners are absolutely required to defeat the enemy, with one of them being where you have to use Baby Yoshi's Gulp move in order to defeat some gigantic clefts in the Glitz Pit. These scenarios are really cool and makes each partner actually seem like they are contributing with their unique abilities while in battle, which is something that isn't really a problem outside of it, as I've already mentioned. At the risk, once again, of turning the battle system into a gimmicky mess, I don't want each battle to require a certain partner's ability to complete. These battles can still exist, as they're a great way of demonstrating their abilities, but for the most part, I just want the player to be rewarded for thinking through each battle instead of simply taking the brute force path, like I mentioned earlier. This would work in tandem with the terrain and elevation system and create a much higher skill ceiling for players in battle, all while keeping it simple enough for beginners. Other than that, though, I don't really have any issues with partners and how they're utilized. It would be cool to have multiple partners in battle at once, sort of creating more of a party system, or having Mario perform attacks in tandem with his partners as sort of a team move similar to the Bros moves from the Mario and Luigi games, but those ideas don't really require any further explanation like the others. Something closely linked to partners, however, is one of the collectibles, Shine Sprites. These are hidden around every area of the world inside these definitely inconspicuous boxes. Since partners don't have their own level level stat in this game, shine sprites are the only method of increasing their stats other than badges, and while they definitely serve to further simplify yet another common RPG mechanic, in a way, the feeling of incremental progress accomplished by leveling up is lost. Whenever you power up a partner with shine sprites, it really feels like you're just immediately jumping forward 3 to 5 levels, since their attack increases by 1 and their health gets a significant boost all at once. There are certain points in the game where your partners will feel underpowered because you haven't found enough shine sprites to upgrade them yet, and vice versa, creating sort of a bottleneck effect. In the grand scheme, this really doesn't affect the overall experience as long as you don't think about it too hard, but remember, additionally, since you can only upgrade partners twice, Mario eventually surpasses their stats by a wide margin if you level him up enough, creating a huge gap in power and survivability during the late and post-game. But the average player most likely won't experience this, since you don't really need to level much further than 30 to see everything the game has to offer. Other than that though, I'm a big fan of shine sprites. While they may not be the most well-hidden collectible, they're more focused around utilizing each partner's ability to collect them, which fits in perfectly with their intended purpose. However, I do have a few problems with the game's other main collectibles, star pieces. While not nearly as significant as shine sprites, star pieces can be used to purchase some of the most useful badges in the game. These are also much more hidden than shine sprites, with very few even being in the line of sight. The exploration required to find these makes collecting them pretty enjoyable, but eventually it starts to get a bit stale. This is because out of the 100 total star pieces in the game, 94 of them are hidden in one of 3 ways. They are either sitting on the ground in plain sight or behind something, under a panel in the floor, or inside of a bush or tree. A mere 6 star pieces deviate from this formula, so the fact that every single other one is essentially hidden in the same way eventually makes finding them very predictable and not nearly as exciting. Kind of like a 30th birthday.
I wish I could see my kids.
Star pieces hidden under panels in the floor, while predictable due to how common they are entirely random in their locations. A few of them are hinted at by NPCs, but for the most part, you are very rarely going to find these on your own unless you consciously decide to slam your ass against the ground everywhere you go. And because of just how many are hidden in this way, you're basically forced to use one of the 2 methods the game gives you to find star pieces a bit more easily. The first method is to speak to Merlovely in the Rogueport sewers, who you can pay to cast some corny ass spell and tell you where a star piece is located that you haven't collected yet. The second method isn't available until later into the game when you're able to unlock the optional 7th party member, Miss Mouse.
God, I wish that was me!
Miss Mouse's ability outside of battle involves sniffing the surroundings and telling you if there are any collectibles nearby. So this doesn't just apply to star pieces, she can find hidden blocks, coins, and items as well, which makes this method suboptimal compared to Merlovely, aside from the small fee of course. Much like with the ass pounding though, you'll be stuck spamming this ability constantly if you want to search every single area for collectibles, which becomes even more inconvenient when you have to swap her out for other partners in order to traverse certain obstacles. In short, neither Miss Mouse or Merlovely are convenient to use in the normal flow of gameplay, both for different reasons, but that's not really the problem though. You can always go back and consult Merlovely or spam Miss Mouse's ability everywhere after you've completed the game if you want to find everything. It's the obscurity of some of these star pieces that makes it unreasonable to find them without using these assistive methods. These 2 methods could and should remain as options in a theoretical sequel, but the way that star pieces are hidden should be given an overhaul. Now, nothing huge can really be done to these since they're what I like to call a wide scope collectible, meaning their main purpose is to be hidden literally everywhere. So I can't, for example, put a series of objectives or small clues behind the location of each singular star piece. In fact, that is much larger in scope than what I was thinking. Remember how I said that 6 of the star pieces weren't hidden in any of those 3 ways I've already mentioned? Well, the methods in which these are collected, as well as the mixture in complexity between each one, is pretty much right on the nose for what I'm looking for. Let's list those 6 off. Number 1. In Poshley Heights, you can walk inside of this hedge in a specific spot to find a star piece. While this is definitely the closest to how they are normally hidden out of these 6, I really like the added required thought of having to spot the small crack in the hedge that allows you to enter. This isn't done anywhere else in the game. Number 2. While on the XS Express, someone steals the soup pot used by Chef Shimi. Finding and returning this pot will award you with a star piece. Number 3. The exact same scenario as number 2, except now you're returning earrings to the waitress. Number 4. Inside one of the cabins on the XS Express, you can search inside a drawer and discover a star piece. Number 5. The same as number 4, except in the office of the Glitz Pit. And finally, number 6. Inside the X-Knot Fortress, you can play a crane game, with one of the prizes being a star piece. I also found it important to point out that 4 out of these 6 all take place during Chapter 6. I'm not sure if they were just feeling extra inspired when making that chapter, but they proportionately did a much better job in that portion of the game. As you can see though, these 6 are hidden with at least a little bit more thought and complexity than all of the others, relatively speaking.
Now observe. Bad game design. Good game design.
You see, it really is that simple. Nintendo doesn't want you to know this stuff, but I'm telling you.
This mixture between varying levels of complexity is something I think could work perfectly in a theoretical sequel. Some star pieces could simply be hidden just out of plain sight, encouraging the player to either explore or survey their surroundings for clues. And this could still work if you hide them under the floor. Or others could be locked behind minigames like the crane in the X-Knot Fortress. Others could be found through completing small side quests such as the scenarios on the XS Express. With these, considering they take considerably longer to collect compared to the others, you could even award multiple star pieces upon completion of the objective to make the player feel like their effort was a bit more worthwhile. To put it short, I want to be kept on my toes when it comes to these collectibles, and also not be forced to use assistive methods in order to find extremely obscure instances that don't have any environmental clues as to their location. Speaking of side quests though, this game has them, all located in the exact same place. The Trouble Center is a small building in Rogueport that houses a bulletin board filled with side quests that gradually expands with more quests as you progress through the story, coming out to a grand total of 30 when it's all said and done. For the most part, I really like this system. A lot of really cool rewards are locked behind completing these quests, such as unlocking multi-item cooking or Miss Mouse as a party member. A few of the required ingredients to fill out your recipe book are also locked behind the completion of troubles. Heck, at one point you even get to fill your entire inventory with shit-stained pants.
Do you think this is what they wanted to come of the Industrial Revolution?
Troubles are great in that they give new purpose to almost every previously visited location in the game, while building upon and establishing new connections and stories involving the various characters at each location. But because of how the system is set up, unfortunately this benefit also happens to be one of its main downfalls. The thing is, only one trouble can be accepted at a time, and many of them have you returning to the same area of the game for different reasons, which obviously creates unnecessary backtracking that could be circumvented by simply allowing the player to accept multiple troubles at once. In addition to this, the only way for the player to know which trouble they currently have accepted is to return to the Trouble Center and ask the person inside. There is no other way to track your progress or status with them other than this, since apparently Mario is too stupid to use a pen and paper. What's even worse is that the guy inside the Trouble Center will only tell you where the initial meeting is supposed to happen in order for the troubles sequence to start, which makes sense within the game's universe, but just isn't convenient from a gameplay perspective. So, for example, if you've gotten past that point of initial contact, then went to do something else and forgot where you were at in the trouble sequence when you came back to it, your only option, aside from an external guide, would be to pay the cancellation fee of 30 coins and restart the trouble from the beginning. Very conveniently, you could simply implement a trouble tracker into the Game Boy SP-like device that you also use to check your email, and easily explain it by saying that Mario fills out the tracker with updated information as he accepts and progresses through troubles, similar to the Bomber's Notebook from Majora's Mask. This tracker could give a list of currently accepted troubles, all the information acquired from each one so far, and possibly even how many new troubles are available to be accepted from the Trouble Center at that time. In fact, it would be amazing to see troubles pop up all over the world instead of exclusively within Rogueport, whether that be directly through NPC conversations or by separate bulletin boards spread throughout the game. It really doesn't make sense that people from across the entire map are sending their troubles into this seemingly unofficial operation happening exclusively within a tiny building in Rogueport. Regardless, by far the most annoying aspect of a few of these troubles has to be the travel time. Similar to how multiple troubles can lead you to the same general area, some troubles can have you traveling extremely long distances to complete them. Take this one for example. The Food I Want is a trouble unlocked after clearing Chapter 3, which takes place in Glitzville. This trouble has you meeting with Babulber back in Petalburg, the first town of the game following Rogueport. The sequence that Babulber sends you on is as follows. Go back to Glitzville, buy a hot dog from the stand, return to Petalburg, and give Babulber the hot dog. But then, this prick has the audacity to ask for yet another hot dog. So if you didn't just happen to buy 2 hot dogs for no reason on your first visit, you get to trudge your sorry ass back to Glitzville again to purchase another phallic food item. After that, when you make your way all the way back to Petalburg for a 3rd time, you hand over the wiener and this fucker looks you straight in the eyes and asks for an entire cake.
Need me to do your taxes while I'm at it? Your car need washed? How about I raise your kids for a few years? Because apparently anything fucking goes at this point!
So then you need to head to the Pianta parlor in Rogueport, buy the cake mix, which is only purchasable with Pianta tokens, a currency exclusively earned within the parlor, then take that cake mix to Zess, have her cook you the mousse cake, and finally return to Petalburg once more to feed this needy twerp for the last time. And what do you get in return for all your hard work? Those dead flowers I mentioned earlier, the ones I missed my kid's funeral for. While that trouble is by far the most extreme example of them all, and yes, there are multiple like that within the list of troubles, tedious, long travel times are no stranger to the trouble system, and the game overall actually. Which leads me to my final point, and what is probably the absolute biggest problem plaguing Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door by a long shot. Pacing is a problem that continues to plague video games to this day, especially in RPGs, and that's because the concept is extremely difficult to master, no matter how experienced you are. If the letters R, P, and G are mentioned in succession anywhere in a game's genre, you might as well start off with a baseline of at least 30 hours of total playtime. That's already significantly longer than just about any other form of media, and considering the fact that you're expected to tell a story throughout the entire span of time that never feels sluggish or rushed at any point is just a bit unreasonable. In Thousand Year Door, this struggle is definitely apparent, sometimes through unfortunate circumstances and other times through design decisions that make you wonder if they were actively trying to waste the player's time. Backtracking is very common in this game and is often used as a way to pad out the length of a certain segment of the adventure to make it seem longer than it actually is. Chapter 4 is probably the worst example of this. In reality, this chapter is probably the shortest out of all of them, but in order for it to feel similar in length to the others, the player is forced to walk back and forth through the Twilight Trail multiple times, even after it has been completely cleared of enemies and hazards with all puzzles solved. There are very few new things you can do on your way back through the trail after you've visited the creepy steeple. It's just a boring walk back across ground you've already tread with zero differences whatsoever. Even worse is that one of the troubles will also send you back through this trail, and if you didn't happen to fight the optional boss inside the creepy steeple the first time around, you'll be doing yet another trek through the trail for that. The solution to this problem is also extremely simple. Once you get to the creepy steeple, a shortcut is unlocked that leads directly back to Twilight Town and skips the trail entirely.
How do you even think of this stuff?
With my brain, I believe.
An even better solution, while considerably more time consuming in terms of development, would be to actually make the Twilight Trail different on the way back. Maybe some enemies could ambush the player and knock down a tree which blocks the original path through the forest, so now they have to solve some puzzles to reveal the new alternate path, and this new path could be considerably shorter than the original one, leading straight back to Twilight Town. Another huge pacing issue comes in the form of Chapter 3 of Glitz and Glory. In this chapter, Mario has to fight his way upwards through the ranks of the Glitz Pit, a large stadium focused around the spectator sport of organized violence. He starts off at the lowest rank, 20, and has to battle every single competitor one by one until he reaches the champion, Rockhawk. The Glitz Pit is separated into the minor and major leagues, with the first 10 fights being the minor league and the second 10 being the major. Each league has their own locker room, which the player has to return to after every single fight and consult the computer terminal to start their next one. You then have to literally just stand there for several seconds waiting for the guy to show up and escort you to the fight. Oh yeah, and if your health is low, you're also gonna have to go watch the going to bed animation before you even think about consulting the computer terminal. You can probably imagine how annoying that can get after doing it 20 times in a row. When it comes to the minor league especially, the game feels like it slows down to an absolute crawl. There are a few moments and sequences that break up the tedious cycle of battles, but as an overall experience, it's honestly kind of boring. Once you get into the major leagues, things start to pick up a little bit, with quite a few cutaways from fighting to perform various tasks around the pit, such as looking further into the dubious nature of Jolene and Grubba's methods of running the arena, along with the mysterious disappearances of past champions. However, none of that completely gets rid of the annoying cycle of fighting, returning to the locker room, sleeping, consulting the computer terminal, rinse and repeat. As for the fights themselves, there are some interesting ones, and Grubba always places random restrictions on each fight to please the crowd, but for the most part, they're nothing to get too excited about and aren't too difficult either. The thing is, narratively and thematically speaking, the Glitz Pit is an awesome idea. I really love the concept as a whole, so if you could simply streamline the fighting process by, say, having Grubba ask Mario if he wants to continue his streak and fight the next contender while still on stage, it would work wonders. Or you could break up the fights even more by having the player do even more activities outside of battling in the arena. After all, almost the entire chapter takes place entirely on the tiny floating island of Glitzville. It would have been really nice for pacing to have the player leave that area once or twice. An even better solution to that would simply be to make Glitzville bigger, with more places to explore. Honestly, even just cutting the amount of fights you have to do could work. Sure, it would kind of put a damper on that feeling of progressing to the top from the very bottom, but it would definitely still be there, and for the sake of gameplay, I think it would be a good change to make. Either way, I could go on and on about every single pacing issue in the game, but you probably get the point. By now, you probably wouldn't be surprised when I tell you that Chapter 7 of the game has you trudging back to every single major location in the world in search of a single character that actually ends up being in the first place you looked for him.
Get it? It's just supposed to be some funny little joke that wastes a very large amount of your time. You may now laugh.
The fast travel pipes in the Rogueport sewers that become available after acquiring the Super Hammer make traversing the world a bit more tolerable, but in no way does it completely solve the problem. It also doesn't help that Mario walks painfully slow in comparison to how much ground you have to cover during the forced backtracking. For some odd reason, the spin dash from the first game is just absent this time around, making movement just that much more tedious. You do unlock the Baby Yoshi partner in Chapter 3 that allows you to move faster, but while riding him, your jump height is severely reduced, you can't interact with anything, and you can't talk to any NPCs, so you are forced to get on and off him repeatedly. On top of this, if you happen to need another partner's ability, you have to bring up the menu, switch to the partner you need, use the ability, bring up the menu again, and switch back. And finally, the last main aspect of the game that contributes to its less than desirable pacing comes down to the level design. Compared to the first game, Thousand Year Door consistently has less interesting design in the areas you traverse. In terms of aesthetic uniqueness and variety, there's no issue, but with the actual layout of these areas, most of them are just so flat. Just about every chapter has a significant amount of flat, boring hallways with a few enemies scattered about. Now, I will admit that there are a few standout exceptions to this that I really enjoyed, such as the Pirate's Grotto and Riverside Station, with the Great Tree and Hooktail Castle not falling far behind, but obviously these aren't the whole game, and with mostly every other area being less than great, it really puts a damper on the enjoyable design of these areas. In the same realm, I don't think the original Paper Mario is immune to this criticism either, it just seemed less common to me in that game. In my opinion, Chapter 7 of Thousand Year Door is the absolute worst offender of this, with basically the entire thing consisting of these types of areas fundamentally, all the way up until the end of the X-Knot Fortress. Admittedly, this wasn't the worst thing in the world since the battle system was engaging enough that I didn't notice it at first, but as soon as you get onto the moon, if you hadn't noticed it before, you'll definitely notice it then, because holy shit is that area boring.
Now, whoa, you don't speak for all of us, man. One of my favorite hobbies is trudging through molasses without any other forms of mental stimulation, so this is right up my alley.
Remember how I mentioned that Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door is one of my favorite games of all time? I sure just made it seem that way. In all seriousness though, especially for a game that came out almost 20 years ago, this is an amazingly well-crafted experience that aged extremely well with all things considered. I would recommend it to just about anyone, it's just that good. If I didn't think so, I wouldn't have just let almost 14,000 words come out of my mouth about it. Now, if there was some aspect of the game that I never mentioned, it's not because I forgot about it. That's obviously not the case. Please consult my verbal word count again. If I didn't mention something, like for example super guarding in battles or the paper transformations, it means I either didn't really have any problems with it, or I didn't have any ideas on how to expand upon it. Not everything needs to be run over with a fine-tooth comb, but I think with what we did discuss, what we have here is a pretty solid framework for a sequel. I'm still holding out for a new and real Paper Mario in the same gameplay style as this one and its predecessor, but if you have at least the slightest bit of sanity, you probably shouldn't hold your breath on that prospect. Besides, I've heard holding your breath for too long can lead to some pretty bad stuff.
Anyway, that's all I really had to say. Sure as hell didn't help me to get out of here, but sometimes you just gotta get stuff off your chest, you know? Hey idiot, still stuck in here? I think so. Well, here's the thing. None of this is real. I may or may not have given you an assortment of hallucinogenic drugs instead of the Luigi pill. Oh, so where am I actually at right now? No idea. I'm not real either. Right. Then that must mean...